Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar, False Promises of Carbon Capture in Louisiana. My name is Caitlin Schmidt, and I'm a policy analyst at the Center for Progressive Reform. The Center for Progressive Reform is a research and advocacy group that harnesses the power of law and public policy to create a responsive government, a healthy environment, and a just society. We're pleased to co-sponsor today's event with the Deep South Center for Environmental Justice, an amazing organization that partners with communities harmed by racially disproportionate pollution burdens and attendant climate vulnerabilities. While there are many forms of carbon capture, sequestration, and storage where carbon dioxide is pulled from the atmosphere and stored in the soil or underground, this webinar focuses on post-combustion carbon capture. This type of carbon capture involves retrofitting point sources like smokestacks and flues with infrastructure to capture the carbon dioxide, compress it, and send it through pressurized pipelines to injection wells, where it is sent underground for quote-unquote long-term storage. However, most of the time it's used in a process called enhanced oil recovery to extract more oil. Overall, this type of carbon capture is an energy-intensive, cost-prohibitive, and risk-laden process that has been oversold in its ability to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. At the same time, this type of carbon capture would require the construction of new infrastructure and hundreds of thousands of miles of dangerous carbon dioxide pipelines near overburdened and underserved communities in parts of the country, including Louisiana. We'd like to express our gratitude towards the 2030 Fund for their support for our broader work on this issue. Today's panelists include Monique Harden, Assistant Director of Law and Policy at the Deep South Center for Environmental Justice and Co-Director of Advocates for Environmental Human Rights, Rob Verchick, Board President at the Center for Progressive Reform and a professor at Loyola University, New Orleans College of Law, and a member of Louisiana's Climate Initiatives Task Force. And last but not least, Karen Sokol, CPR member scholar and professor at Loyola University, New Orleans College of Law. Now I'd like to pass it over to Rob to get us started.
Let me unmute. It's good to see everybody, and thanks so much for joining us. This is a really important topic, in part because while Biden's overall climate agenda seems to be stalled in Congress, President Biden has managed to win billions of dollars in federal funding for at least one pillar of his administration's energy platform, his climate change action platform, and that is carbon capture and sequestration. That's a technology that's won praise from the industrial sector for sure in the United States, from Republicans and from Democrats, many of them, and also from some environmental organizations. And many states are preparing for the expansion of what I'll call CCS, carbon capture sequestration projects, including in Louisiana, where I live and where I have been working a lot on this climate action task force, which has just recently, just last month, we submitted a proposal to eliminate net GHG emissions by 2050 for the state of Louisiana. We're only one of two states in the South that have that commitment. I'm really proud of that. And over the last 2 years, I've been trying to keep a really open mind about carbon capture and storage in Louisiana and elsewhere. And I've talked to a lot of people about this and done a lot of reading and research. And I'm approaching it as kind of an economic and a policy and a fairness issue. I'm not a scientist, but I've talked to an awful lot of scientists about this as we go. And here's where I come down, and this is where I came down on the task force in Louisiana as well. I think that the very, very best carbon capture and storage will play a very marginal role in limiting greenhouse emissions in the United States and elsewhere. And I'm not optimistic at all that best case scenario can hold. At the worst, or at the medium, if you will, I think that instead what's going to happen is that these subsidies for technologies are going to prolong demand for fossil fuel. They're going to squander money that would otherwise be spent on replacing coal and oil and gas. And that they're going to lead to a lot of injustices in environmental justice communities that we don't need to have by foisting risks and burdens of this technology on marginalized communities, and by depriving these communities of reductions in toxic pollution that they would have won had we been working with renewables. So that's where I am coming down on this. And the more I think about it, the more I think that if I were just interested as a policy person in reducing greenhouse gases, I can't imagine that I would pick CCS as even part of that conclusion. The only reason I think I would is if I was also interested in trying to make a profit for burning fossil fuels while I was doing it. And because I don't think that that's necessarily a legitimate reason to be engaged in a climate project, that's kind of where I come down. I think the better choice is a much rapid shift toward energy efficiency and carbon free energy sources. Now, the argument on the other side is a not persuasive, but it's a strong argument. It's that we have a lot of underground geological sites in the United States. We can store, some scientists say, up to 2.5 trillion tons of carbon dioxide, and that's as much as the country's ever emitted in history. But they're really, really big hurdles to this technology. One is it's unproven, and we are still not sure that it will ever work. Remember, we're trying to store carbon dioxide in what's called a supercritical state, kind of a semi-liquid gas state, underground in sedimentary rock, if we're talking about Texas, Louisiana, forever. Right? And it's incredibly energy intensive to do that. It's very expensive. There are lots of dangers that attend that: earthquakes, explosions, asphyxiation of people and livestock, a lengthy process for building out that infrastructure that's going to go 10, 20, 30 years and then lock us into using it. We already know there are leaks and failures to capture, and that can be fudged. And what's really interesting to me is this can't even be done at scale. The most optimistic estimates of capturing and storing carbon for the United States would be less than 4%, and as we'll see in Louisiana, it's just as bleak. Just to give you an idea, we have 12 active CCS projects in the U.S. right now, and only one of those is intended to permanently store the gas. The rest of them pump the carbon down in oil reservoirs in order to scare up more oil to burn, which of course defeats the purpose of it. The funding is very interesting. The federal government, I said, is posed to make the largest investment ever, more than $12 billion in various kinds of capture removal technologies. That money comes from the infrastructure bill that passed, the Infrastructure and Jobs bill. Now, a quarter of that 12 billion goes to something called ambient air capture, which we're not talking about today. Sometimes it's referred to as direct air capture. Professor Sokol's going to talk a little bit about that. But $8 billion of what I just described does go to CCS, to pipelines, commercial subsidies, low interest loans, government permitting programs, and these kinds of things. And these kinds of subsidies are also happening throughout Europe and Canada and Australia as well. We already in the United States have a tax credit program. It's called 45Q, and that pays industry $50 a ton for permanently storing carbon, which is actually not happening except for one site. And then it pays them $35 to put the carbon underground, not to store it permanently, but just to scare up more oil to burn. The Biden administration, the Build Back Better plan, wants to increase that. He wants $85 a ton for permanent storage and $60 a ton to use carbon to scare up more oil to burn. California also has certain kinds of subsidies in its program to reward CCS. The problem is that despite all of the billions that have been spent on this, the CCS industry has really failed even its own expectations. The Government Accounting Office shows that over $1 billion, this is before the statutes I talked about, $1 billion were invested by the Department of Energy in 9 different CCS projects over the last 7 years. Of those 9, only 2 are operating at all anymore. And the reason is because technological problems and that the costs are too high, which gets back to this idea that this is just an amazingly expensive way to keep the oil and gas companies able to burn fossil fuels by vacuuming the pollution and then putting it under the ground for someone else to deal with. Think about the money you could spend if you just spent that money trying to do something else, right? There have been a lot of high-profile failures of this. In 2020, the Petronova, which is the poster child for many advocates of CCS, $1 billion project in Texas went belly up. For 2 reasons. One is it was too expensive, and 2, it missed its carbon capture goals by 17%. Other technologies like electrification or hydrogen fuels that could be made from renewable electricity seem to be more cost effective, and that's going to be an important point that I want to get to. The response to all of this, and I've talked to a lot of people in Louisiana, and particularly about this, but I've talked to people in Washington D.C. and in industry and in Silicon Valley and other places where people are working on this. The main issue seems to be this: is that people mainly agree that we don't need to bury CO2 in the ground so much as we need to be reducing CO2. But what they tend to say is that, well, there are some special cases that need to be dealt with, one of which is heavy industry, like cement production, for instance. You need huge amounts, inferno degrees of heat, and it's hard to build that with hard to make that with electricity, at least with current technology. Another thing people say, and this happens in Louisiana and Texas, where we make a lot of fertilizers out of ammonia, is that it's really hard to make ammonia without that kind of super heat. Although you can make ammonia without heat at all through a catalytic process that's actually being developed in Europe, where the price of natural gas is higher. But so heavy industry seems to be a special case. And then the other idea is that, well, we still have fossil fuel plants that are going to be running for the next 10, 15 years, and we need something to do with the pollution that they produce, which assumes, of course, that we're going to have fossil fuel companies running for 10 or 15 years. I mean, that's a choice that we make. They also say that this fear of leaks, and it's a real fear. Recall that none of these projects are capturing at the rates that they say they are, and recall that we already have huge problems of leakage with methane and everything else in our infrastructure. The counter is that, well, we need more government monitoring, reporting, and verification. And if everyone were just more responsible and had larger budgets in their agencies, we could account for this. I heard many of these arguments in Louisiana, and in part because we have some of those special issues. And if I could ask Caitlin or Maggie to show the first slide that I wanted to show. This is a slightly dated slide, but you get the idea. Most in the United States, as you can see on the left-hand side, most of the carbon footprint comes from transportation and the generation of electricity. All right, almost every state has a profile that looks very much like that. Louisiana is different. Louisiana, we don't have the most people in the country, as you know, but we're the 8th largest emitter of carbon, of greenhouse gases. And the reason for that is our heavy industry. And so if you see on the right, you see that says 61%, the real number updated is 66%. 66% of our carbon emissions come essentially from refining fossil fuels and from producing chemicals like fertilizers. And those are really heat intensive. And like I said, there are questions about how do you use electrification to do that. What we found in Louisiana, right, because this is the place, remember, where industry is really, really pushing for carbon capture and sequestration. They want to build whole new networks of pipelines through our wetlands, which which we already have a crisis with, through Cancer Alley and other environmental justice communities. They want to build all of this, and they want billions and billions of dollars, not just in federal money, but in state subsidies too, because there's no money to be made in the marketplace for doing this. If you're an oil and gas company, the only money to be made is if you can get someone like the government to pay you to store all of this stuff underground, right? And incidentally, in the state of Louisiana, says it'll even be title to the land after all the sequestration has happened. So companies don't even have to bear the burden of liability if anything goes wrong, explosions, earthquakes, and these kinds of things, right? In the meantime, they say it's safe, and in the other way, they say, well, we're not going to do it unless the state owns the land after we inject the gas. But what we found in our own scientifically driven process at the task force, where we had people at the table from industry and people at the table from oil and gas and people at the table from engineering and so on. Here's what we found, and I want to ask if we can move to the next slide. It's kind of busy. This is our road, if you will, to getting to net zero by 2050. And you'll see that there are all kinds of things on our climate action plan which we have proposed, right? Those really big ones, like that top one, is industrial electrification. That's the thing I was talking about that they're doing more of in Europe, and that we're just on the cusp of trying to develop, right? And then low and no carbon hydrogen production. Some of that uses CCS, but some of that also does not use CCS. Now, if we could just move to the next slide, using tools, analytical tools provided by the federal government, all right, the federal government's best scientists and the best folks in the state of Louisiana with the government working on this, that little circle that the arrow is pointing to is the best case scenario for what industrial CCS will do in Louisiana. Right, and so it's actually, I mean, you can see it's actually something like less than 10 million metric tons. It's a rounding error almost, right? So I'm not going to say that it's not nothing, but what I am going to say is if you compare that, right, to the harms that you're going to hear about from Monique Harden, and you compare that to all the money that I've already talked to you about, it doesn't seem like a very good investment. It seems like a much better investment would be in technologies like they're using in the Netherlands and Germany and right now, looking at technologies to make ammonia and other chemical products without using high heat, right? Through processes that are in development in the same way that CCS is now in development. Nothing is ready for prime time at this point. The only question is, where are we going to put the chips on the table, right? Are we going to put our chips on the table for something that's not prime time, so it might not work, or that in 20 years it will be the bridge that we wish we had 20 years ago? The problem is it just doesn't seem like a very good investment for all of the disadvantages that it has. I don't think, when we're talking about, again, burying carbon that we're capturing from exhaust in an industrial process into sedimentary rock like we have in Louisiana and Texas, and this is mostly what the Biden administration is thinking about, it just doesn't make a lot of policy sense. And it's that circle right there that I keep thinking of every time that I have discussions with people about CCS. So there are other reasons and other ways to think about that, but I am gonna stop there, and maybe only to say one other thing, and that is, if all of that were to work, you would have to have an administrative system that monitored and reported, and that was fully funded, and that looked for all the leaks and all of that kind of thing. And in the state of Louisiana, we have a state agency. Many states want their own agencies to have the power to do this under federal law, and the EPA has the option of allowing agencies to do that. Were Louisiana to get that, I think it would be extremely unfortunate. The Department of Natural Resources is already charged with monitoring many kinds of injection wells, although not this type that I'm talking about. And the last legislative audit found that our agency did not sufficiently monitor those wells. It did not sufficiently inspect those facilities, and it did not go after known violators. And so how do you, even if you believe the technology, even if you're willing to spend the money, how do you get past that problem? And it's not just a technicality, all right? If you don't have state agencies that are actually monitoring and inspecting and going after violators, none of this works at all, right? And you just have even more of the problems that I'm talking about. So I will stop there, and happy to hear questions, and really happy to hear from my colleagues on this webinar. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Rob. So I'm going to kick it over to Karen, who will provide a broader international legal context around carbon capture and the shift in industry messaging in the response to the IPCC report. So over to you, Karen.
Thanks, Caitlin, and thanks to CPR and Deep South Center for co-sponsoring this, and for everyone in the audience for joining us. So like Caitlin said, I'm going to draw the camera back and provide a bit of international context for the goals stated in the plan, the idea of net zero, and the industry's role in really advancing carbon capture, storage, and utilization as a potential climate solution. So just give me a moment to share my screen. So most governments working on a climate plan, like the Climate Initiatives Task Force that Rob is serving on, they name this 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial global temperatures as the target, that is the destination on the road that Rob described. And that comes from the International Climate Agreement, known as the Paris Agreement, on which the parties to it, the United States is a party, agreed to pursue all efforts to limit warming to 1.5 degrees above Celsius. And that's in recognition that the target of 2 degrees Celsius, which until 2015, when the parties opened the Paris Agreement for signature, that had been the working goal, that it looked like that was too high. And so what the parties did when they opened this agreement for signature, they asked the International Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, which is a body of scientists from all over the world that compile reports for the public, but also for the policymakers who are going to be implementing the Paris Agreement, the governmental policymakers. And they asked the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change draft a report compiling the scientific evidence that assesses the impacts of 2 degrees Celsius, what a planet will look like at 2 degrees versus 1.5 degrees. And the IPCC issued that report a few years later in 2018. And for our purposes, there's a couple of key takeaways from that report. So first, it's definitely the case that 1.5 degrees is much, much better than 2 degrees Celsius. It's the difference between, for example, no coral reefs and only losing a little over 90%, I believe. But that's still a lot of coral reefs. So 1.5 is not by any means safe. So the lower, the better. That's the limit. But the lower, the better. The more you can do to decrease emissions and thus global temperatures, the better. And then IPCC also policymakers some working numbers and deadlines that you also see in a lot of climate plans. So that's to limit to 1.5 degrees net anthropogenic carbon dioxide emissions, decline emissions, because emissions are directly correlated to increase in temperature rise, below 2010 levels by 2030. And then this idea of net zero, which you see in so many plans, net zero by 2050. And in the executive order in which Governor Edwards created the Climate Initiative Task Force, he adopted this Paris Agreement goal, 1.5. That's what we're gonna, our plan is gonna be targeted toward limiting to that. And you see that net zero, that path to net zero that Rob showed you. And that's also what the Biden administration has undertaken at the national level, and purportedly all the parties to the Paris Agreement. The other very important thing that the IPCC put out there was it gave a lot of information indicating that we're giving you the destination, and policymakers are the ones who have to think about how we get there. But it matters a lot how we get there in terms of the likelihood of achieving that temperature goal, and in terms of what the world is going to look like. We're going to transition into another world one way or another. So in terms of the likelihood of success, and policymakers, that's on you to figure out all those little wedges in your road to net zero to ensure that they're smart decisions. So it was interesting because it was not only governments, local, national, at the international level, that started adopting this 1.5 degrees Celsius and this idea of net zero. The fossil fuel industry, which has been well aware of what's going on at the international level for a long time, up until a few years before the IPCC report, was really engaging in systematic, overt climate denial, calling the science into question, specifically calling out the IPCC and making every attempt to undermine international climate goals. Really fighting them. If you read the text of this mobile ad, it's attacking the IPCC and essentially the United Nations Framework and Convention on Climate Change. That started to shift. So right around the time around the few years before the 1.5 degrees Celsius report, demands for climate action were starting to grow. They only got louder after that because the urgency was really ramped up in the wake of that. And the industry shifted its rhetoric a bit. And the industry was suddenly talking about being aligned with the Paris Agreement goals and with the idea of net zero. So using all this international climate goals and purporting to be part of the solution, really shifting itself from attacking any sort of climate solution to being the solution, to being an essential part of the solution. So there's this idea of we have to think in terms of all of the above. That's what the industry has really been pushing. And key as part of that mix is oil and gas. And in fact, it's a priority. It is indeed the part of the policy solution that's essential. We as an industry are essential, which it doesn't first blush make a lot of sense, because the climate crisis, the rise in the emissions, is by and large is a result of increased fossil fuel production. So how is it that this can be part of the solution? One of the big ways the industry is trying to reconcile that glaring conflict is promoting very large scale carbon capture. So the idea that we can keep producing fossil fuels, combusting them, and we will just take care of that waste. We'll capture it. And so this is really how the industry has been advancing this as a climate solution. And it's become a big part of the discussions, not just at the Climate Initiatives Task Force, but the Biden administration. It's getting a lot of airtime over other solutions in a way that, if you think of the large context and the nature of this emergency as a fossil fuel driven emergency, makes absolutely no sense. But here we are. And so I also wanted to just dive slightly, not that deep, much deeper, but a little bit into the net zero idea and where the idea of carbon capture, utilization, storage might fit. So the idea of net zero at its core, it's really just about how the climate system works. So you can sort of think of the climate system like a bathtub, and the water is greenhouse gas emissions, kind of a bubbly bathtub's much nicer than carbon emissions, but this is, and it's overflowing. And we've got to stabilize it. We've got to get level so the water is not getting out of the bathtub there. And so net zero is based on this idea that the water can be turned off and it can be drained. So carbon is emitted and it's removed. So like a bath with the taps on, you can either turn the faucet down or off by stopping that water completely, right? You stop the production, reduce production, and there are no emissions to come out. We can also drain it from the atmosphere. So what are known as legacy emissions, those already in the atmosphere, you can remove those. Now the climate system naturally does that by our natural sinks, our forests, our wetlands, our oceans. Rob also mentioned briefly the idea of direct air capture. It's a very nascent technology. It's human created. We don't know it works. We know the natural sinks work, but it's the same principle. It's that drain. It takes it from the atmosphere. Now, post-combustion carbon capture, whether it's utilization or storage, does not fit into either of those categories. It's kind of best thought of like somewhere in between. You keep producing and emitting. So you're creating, you keep producing and you're creating emissions, but you cap them before they get, supposedly before they get to the atmosphere. Now the industry, you'll see industry representatives on the Climate Initiatives Task Force, or if they're just touting it in the halls of lobbying Congress, they try to shove this into either decreasing emissions, right, that turning the faucet down, or to carbon removal, but it really doesn't fit into either one of these. So in thinking about broadly the policy options in the road, how we get there, we know, and Rob talked a lot about this, we know this works. Decreasing production, there won't be any emissions to capture or anything. That's going to work in terms of decreasing emissions. It's also got a lot of other great benefits, because carbon dioxide is not the only thing that is emitted as a result of fossil fuel combustion. It's deadly air pollution that won't happen if we decrease that. The other thing that we know we need to do anyway is restore our natural carbon sinks. That also has all other kinds of benefits. And we know it works. We know they're good sinks because it would be a lot warmer if they weren't soaking up a lot of the emissions that they have already. So we know those should be prioritized. Those are what the essential, that's what works. That's what's going to give us all these other benefits. And anything else should be carefully and fully considered. It's not just this blanket, all of the above approach. We have this overarching objective, this road, this destination, but in carving that road, it's so essential in making any sort of policy, but particularly a policy that we know is going to transition us into a different world that's either just or less just, to really think about how we get there. And now I'm going to turn it over to Monique to tell us a little bit more about the implications of making this a big wedge in our roadmap.
Thanks, Karen. Caitlin, can you pull up my presentation? Good afternoon, everyone. I think while Caitlin's doing that, I just want to correct one thing in the intro that you gave for me, which is in my former life, I was a co-director of Advocates for Environmental Human Rights. So that was a former job that I had before joining the Deep South Center for Environmental Justice. So what I want to focus on today is this question: should Louisiana be a target for carbon waste projects? And by carbon waste projects, I'm trying to bring more clarity to what is meant by carbon capture and storage. I think the words capture and storage should be put in at the very least quotation marks because the technology has not been proven that the carbon is captured or that it can be stored permanently. Next slide. So a path forward we have for Louisiana at the Deep South Center for Environmental Justice is really doing the work of environmental justice married with climate mitigation and climate action. That if you divorce or do one without the other, you really wind up not achieving either. The photos that you see are with Marathon Oil Refinery in the background in St. John Parish. We're at the home of Mr. Coleman, who's wearing the black T-shirt. We're actually standing. His home is behind where he and other people are standing, but the ground that they're standing on is actually the home of his mother, who's no longer with us. But this home was torn down in Hurricane Ida last year. Mr. Coleman has tremendous complaints, as you can imagine, with living near such a expansive oil refining operation that goes on at the Marathon site, including an explosion that occurred just a few weeks ago. And he's sharing his story with the EPA Administrator, Michael Regan, who's in the neutral colored blazer. Dr. Wright is in black standing next to him, and Mr. Robert Taylor, who's the leader of the Concerned Citizens of St. John, who put this visit together with the administrator, is there to talk about community-driven solutions that are centered around pollution reduction and preventing industrial hazards, such as those that Mr. Coleman has experienced at the Marathon Oil Refinery. Next to that is a photograph of a home that's just been demolished by the winds and the forceful winds of Hurricane Ida. And you just have the resident, the homeowner, just at his wit's end, stressed out and traumatized by look at the damage done to his home and where is he going to go from here. And so this idea around connecting climate change and environmental justice together, because it's the stuff that comes out of the smokestacks and connectors at that oil refinery that not only causes the serious safety and health concerns that Mr. Coleman has, but also the concerns that we all have in Louisiana and around the world around climate risks. So a path forward for Louisiana, we just want to reiterate, is both environmental justice and climate mitigation. And it's important to really invest in community-driven solutions because right now we don't have a legal way of remedying environmental racism or the proliferation of greenhouse gas emissions. So going into communities and looking at the solutions people have put together and investing in it it should be a priority. And one thing that you don't see community folks talking about is carbon capture sequestration or carbon capture storage. Next slide. So the unexamined impacts of carbon capture and storage. It's been promoted by people that includes our Governor John Bel Edwards of Louisiana and oil and gas companies as a solution to the climate problem. And they say this without looking at any or sharing any of the impacts of what this kind of enterprise involves. And I want to take some time to do that. The idea of collecting or capturing carbon waste from industrial facility, many of them aging, incident-prone operations, is something that doesn't have clear environmental regulations in terms of what that capturing or collection should do or how it should, what the process should be for it. that's a huge problem because the potential is there for spills and leaks and other hazards just in the process of capturing and collection. The second phase is moving that carbon waste from that industrial facility along pipelines to a destination for underground storage. And one of the things that we know about carbon dioxide is that it's a highly corrosive material. And there hasn't been an engineering report that has the quintessential material for pipeline construction that can withstand the corrosive effect of carbon dioxide over time. So we're talking about more leaks and opportunities for that carbon dioxide to also, move on into the atmosphere where we'll, continue to have the adverse impact on our planet and adding and contributing to the climate crisis. And then last is the places where storage would go. That's the sites of that have not been developed in terms of understanding the vulnerability of sites, the suitability of sites for such a process for injection of industrial carbon waste. And what you see, what's there is a graphic from the U.S. Geological Survey of an area of Perry Ridge that is undergoing a stabilization project because of previous industrial damage that's been done to the area. And it's this area of Perry Ridge that is a site being currently proposed by a company called Gulf Coast Sequestration, The name of the company is Gulf Coast Sequestration, that has an application to EPA seeking permit to inject carbon in a well in the Perry Ridge area in Southwest Louisiana. So we just have, this unexamined impacts is a real concern because it shows the irresponsibility to ensure that health and safety and are really going to be protected. Next slide. So another concern is the lack of regulatory controls. As I mentioned before, the process around capturing or collecting carbon waste from an industrial facility there's an omission there in terms of our regulations, but there's also an omission in terms of what is known about what actually the chemical constituency of that stream. Deep South Center for Environmental Justice and the Healthy Gulf Organization, we collaborated together in putting together a Freedom of Information Act request to EPA that asks a number of questions. One of the questions reads as follows, where we requested all records related to the sampling or testing of a carbon dioxide stream captured from an industrial emission source, including all documents indicating the result of such sampling or testing. And the response we got back from EPA is as follows. EPA has no agency records in response to this request, meaning that the agency is allowing this to go forward without knowing itself what could possibly be in the streams collected by various facilities in industrial sectors like petroleum refining, power plants, you name it. Next slide. To make matters worse in terms of the lack of a regulatory control is the application put forward by the Louisiana Department of Natural Resources. And this is that doesn't address its capacity to be able to manage and administer a program for permitting that requires vigilant monitoring and enforcement. This is a department that has given us, community travesties from community travesties across the state, and where the harm from DNR's failed, negligent administration of existing well programs are still with us. In response to its draft application to the Environmental Protection Agency. I just wanted to note that there was a total of 28 comments submitted to the Department of Natural Resources. You can find on their website. And of those 28 comments, they were all in opposition to DNR's application. None of the comments were in favor of it. Currently, right now, what we're looking at is a Biden administration that's beginning to look into the issue of impacts of carbon capture sequestration after much, activities have gone forward in promoting it, I think, quite irresponsibly. And one of those actions I want to note and lift up is the White House Council on Environmental Quality that has issued proposed guidance that focuses on impact analysis and consultation with community stakeholders for carbon capture storage projects. And that is open actually for public comment as we speak. The other thing that I think is extremely important that I wanted to mention is that there's a slew of projects that are being proposed, not existing fossil fuel burning types of industrial operations, but new ones like blue hydrogen that are using the mantra of carbon capture storage as a panacea for all of the damaging effects of its facility in terms of climate change. And so what we're seeing is the way in which carbon capture storage has the effect of actually extending the life, if you will, for more and more burning of coal, oil, and gas, and with knowing that where those facilities are operating, where new facilities would be sited, would continue and perpetuate the harm and violation of environmental racism that communities suffer and really deserve a remedy in this country. So, the idea of this carbon capture storage is one that, I'm encouraging people, especially here in Louisiana, to begin calling out our governor that, promoting this kind of an enterprise that has an 80% failure rate, according to a 2021 study published in Environmental Research Letters, and promises to further harm communities without any appreciable gain in terms of climate mitigation sets us back in the state. It doesn't move us forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Monique. Really appreciate it. So now we've got about 12 minutes to answer questions in the chat. So if you've got any questions, please feel free to post those in the Q&A box. Right now we've got about 15 questions, so we'll go ahead and jump right into things. So Rob, I'm going to send it to you for this first question, or sorry, Karen, actually, I'll send this one to you. So with recent events from Spring Gaines, there is an ongoing push for some legislators for energy independence. As an instrument for enhanced oil recovery, would post-combustion carbon capture be a part of that equation as a plus for pushing more U.S. oil and gas?
So thanks for the question. I think it's a good point, and what it's really doing is calling out the industry, and so it will take every opportunity it can to push for more oil and gas. And just to draw the camera back and think a bit about broader context again, Putin's war is paid for by fossil fuels. He has his power because of fossil fuels. And until very, very recently, American oil companies were very, very involved with oil and gas, with the Russian oil and gas industry, and were buying Russian oil and suddenly said they were pulling out of there. And so the idea that they are now behind energy independence is just another opportunity. And I haven't seen, to answer the question, I haven't seen the two brought together in terms of pushing for more enhanced oil recovery. I mean, the idea of carbon and capture is it's just a cover. to continue producing. And so is this. The idea of getting more permits now that will not do anything to change the supply is it's just really crazy, but it's just par for the course for the industry. And it's just a reminder that when the fossil fuel industry is promoting solutions to anything, whether it is reining Putin in or climate action, it's just really, really problematic when fossil fuels are the sources of all these problems.
Thank you for that, Karen. All right, so the next question up we've got from Jonathan Leo. And so he mentions that geologic sequestration is intended to be permanent, but my understanding is that some undetermined volume of the gases so sequestered are intended to be used in enhanced oil recovery. What's your take on the extent to which enhanced oil recovery, in fact, will become a robust sub-industry within the larger sector? And is there any kind of penalty under the 45Q misuse of gases sequestered pursuant to incentives provided by that regulation? So I think Karen actually did address some of that question, but just sort of want to put a point in that with the 45Q tax program, majority of that money goes towards enhanced oil recovery. And the only verification requirements are that within 3 years, carbon dioxide does not leak. After that, there's no sort of verification of any kind, shape, or form, ensuring that the carbon dioxide actually stays in the ground. So just wanted to sort of quickly answer that one. And then we can jump along to Jamie Gather's question, which is, how do we find a way to change the narrative when the corpo governmental collusion and media seems to push for only big oil, big ag, big military, and big pharma? And then she goes on to say, are most of the planned mitigations still yet to be developed? And this one's directed towards Rob.
So one of those questions is super, super hard, and the other one I could probably have some kind of an answer for. The super hard one is how you change the narrative, and I think that one of the important things is that we just keep talking about it and refusing to accept the frame that's being presented. And this comes to the other idea. We are constantly, I think, we in the environmental area or whatever are said, we're asked to accept things essentially the way they are. So, one thing that happened in the task force and that happens in every state, I guarantee you, is we start with this discussion of how are we going to provide all of this oil. We refine oil in Louisiana. Oil is very heat intensive and so on, and it's going to put out greenhouse gases when we do it. Well, there are two ways that you might address that problem. One would be technology, which I'll get to, but the other one would be why not produce less oil, right? Why don't people just consume less oil? And what we often hear from the oil and gas industry is, oh, well, people are demanding it. It's your fault. With everyone who's driving a car, it's their fault. We're just producing the oil. But you really could, right, think about, well, how, whether it's cap and trade, which some people like, some people don't, or putting a price on carbon, or regulating in some more straightforward way. You really could say, no, we can do without as much oil, or we make a lot of plastics in Louisiana. That's our chemical industry. We could do a lot. We could do without some of those plastic forks and knives, right? And if we did that, we would be reducing the need for chemicals, which would be another way of reducing the production of greenhouse gas emissions that come from that. The more technological side is, okay, well, you have to make some plastic, you got to make some oil, you got to make some ammonia for fertilizer. So you could reduce fertilizer use too, incidentally. But so what do you do, assuming that you've got to make some? And that's the technological problem. But again, I ask, why don't we have the technological solutions yet? And the reason we don't isn't because we're not smart. The reason we don't have that is because there aren't the economic incentives to encourage scientists and so on to develop ways of producing ammonia without heat, using electrolysis, and so on. I said a lot of that is happening in Europe, and the reason it is happening in Europe and not in the United States All right, and I'm talking about the Netherlands and Germany and the UK. The reason is because they have always spent more money on natural gas than we do. And because natural gas is, which is one of the feedstocks of what I'm talking about. So because they have to pay more for natural gas, they are naturally trying to figure out ways to make ammonia and all these other things without using this. Down in Texas, Louisiana, and so on, when I talk to people in the industry sector, it's almost like water, natural gas. You know, they're like, well, we got so much of it, we got to use it. It's just lying around. And so there's no incentive to try to figure out how to make things without natural gas or how to make things without other kinds of fossil fuels. But if we rethought the economic system, we would have the right incentives in place, and we would be building that stuff. And incidentally, it's a lot more cost effective to try to figure out how to make ammonia through electrolysis than, I would say, trying to bury pollution under the ground from now until the next few thousand years.
Great, thank you, Rob. So this next one's for Monique from the anonymous attendee. I'm going to shorten it just in the interest of time. How can we communicate to DC that we need infrastructure, resources to preserve the Black and Indigenous towns in this area, an area that has been targeted for LNG export, blue projects, and CCS? How can we communicate to DC that Senator Cassidy's support for the LNG export and blue projects would make these towns unlivable? So over to you, Monique.
Sure. Well, I think the answer is democratic action, right? The exercise of that. The reason why there's now a federal executive order signed by President Biden that marries both the delivery of environmental justice with tackling climate change is because people voted for that. And so it's more of that direction of, in terms of full participation in how these decisions are made, that's going to make a difference. And I think the more people are plugged in and realizing that it's about where we live, it's about our communities, it's about our future and the lives of generations to come, should be part of, informing the voting decisions we make. But know that there's this executive order and that it does require an all of government approach. And one of the schisms that, of course, has occurred is that you've got some parts of the administration cheerleading for carbon capture storage without any discussion of the impacts for communities. And then you have another area of the administration that's saying, wait a minute, there's a problem, hold up, let's look at this a little closer. And so I guess the good news is that it's not all of in support of carbon capture storage, but it does mean that there's much work to do around getting these impacts examined fully before any decisions are made about these projects. The other piece to that is equity and hurricane recovery in Plaquemines Parish, where that racial equity in terms of disaster assistance and disaster recovery doesn't happen. And that's also part of another fight, because being able to maintain the place you have home, is challenged with hurricanes, and it's also challenged by industrial developments and plans for more like liquefied natural gas terminals. But I guess the other piece to know is that this is not a single person's job. There are a lot of organizations, people and communities here in the state of Louisiana committed to getting this right and working together. And feel free to give us a call at Deep South Center for Environmental Justice if you'd like to be a part of that, join in this effort. It's going to take every one of us.
Great. So we are right at the hour. So I'm going to pull my moderator privilege and go ahead and end the discussion. We had so many great questions. Apologies, we weren't able to get to all of them, but our inboxes are open. So please feel free to reach out to either organization, and we'd be happy to further engage in discussion and answer your questions. So thank you so much again for joining today's webinar, and be on the lookout for a recording. Thank you again.